For the cinema-loving audience, the horror movie genre has always been one filled with fascination and intrigue. The blood dripping from the mouth, repulsive monstrous creatures suddenly making their appearance, the vampires hunting the innocent, the psychotic scientists conducting sinister experiments in the dark, the black magicians inviting the demons, the witches avenging their deaths, and the dead rising up from the grave to traumatize the living are all the well-explored contours of most of the horror movies. Today, we bring to you 20 classic British horror movies of the 1970s, which will surely give you a spine-chilling experience and frightening nightmares. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. Now, this is a small clip for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Deathline, aka Raw Meat. University student Patricia and her American student exchange boyfriend Alex find a man named James Manfred lying unconscious on the stairwell of the Russell Square station. The duo inform the police but find that Manfred has suddenly vanished. Inspector Calhoun undertakes the investigation and accuses Patricia and Alex of having robbed Manfred. His accusations are refuted when one of his colleagues narrates the story about the descendants of the Victorian railway workers who were responsible for building the London Underground, who were still residing deep inside the tunnel. The urban legend believes that these inhabitants had surprisingly survived the 1892 cave-in and have occupied the tunnels for a century now, to everyone's oblivion. The scene then shifts to a man who's dressed in torn, dirty clothes, and his face is unbearable and disgusting to look at, as it seems to be infested with some disease, sitting beside a pregnant woman, presumably his wife, who's in the same condition. Seeing her condition deteriorate, the man drags the unconscious Manfred and stabs him in the neck to allow his wife to drink fresh human blood. After some time, she passes away, and the man is now completely devastated and left in solitude. He thus walks through the tunnel, groaning in pain and crying, and ends up brutally killing 3 maintenance workers who had come down inside the tunnel to inspect the noises. Later, one night, Patricia gets abducted by the cannibal and struggles to escape. Meanwhile, the cannibal incoherently tries to communicate with her, but fails. The cannibal's frustration leads him to violently attacking Patricia, but she's soon saved by Alex. In the climax, the police officials discover several bunkers that have in them the dead and decaying corpses on whom the cannibal would have fed for years to survive. The movie, more than the jump scares, offers the gore elements of cannibalism and the struggle for survival in the underground tunnels where normal human life doesn't exist. The movie's ultimate horror element is imagining the psychological trauma that the remaining descendants of the railway workers would have been through after being isolated beyond normal human society, such that they were turned into cannibals for their survival.
Flee through the windows! Fly from the gate!
Beyond the Graves. The Gate Crasher. The first story begins with a man named Edward Charlton who visits an antique store and decides to buy a mirror. He negotiates with the seller, falsely claiming that the mirror ain't authentic, thus he should sell it for a lower price, and the seller accepts. Later, Edward hosts a party at his flat where he tells his girlfriend that he had indeed duped the seller because the mirror is surely authentic and has much more monetary value for what he bought it for. At the party, someone suggests that they should hold a seance, given the mirror just gives away some unsettling, ghostly vibes. During the ritual, Edward envisions a man dressed in a cape and with a lot of swords around his waist, one of which he uses to stab Edward, after which he comes back to his senses. Later that night, Edward, to his horror, realizes that the man he'd encountered during the ritual was now seen in the antique mirror. The ghostly man takes control of Edward's conscience, and Edward begins luring people into his flat and killing them in cold blood. Edward's last victim is his neighbor. After killing the neighbor, the ghost leaves the mirror and takes up a human form, declaring to have achieved immortality. He then claims that if Edward would kill himself, he too would be able to attain eternity. Persuaded by this, Edward kills himself by impaling himself on a knife. A few years later, Edward's ghost appears again in the mirror to the latest owners and demands to be fed, as he's hungry for human blood. An act of kindness. The story begins with Christopher Lowe, who befriends a man named Jim Underwood, who had earlier been a soldier but is now selling matches and shoelaces to make ends meet. Lowe is a frustrated, unsatisfied office-going man who's belittled by his wife Mabel back home and is looked down upon by his son. His inferiority complex and desire for respect tempted him to lie to Jim about his military service, where he claims that he too had been a decorated and revered soldier. To add credibility to his lie, Lowe steals the Distinguished Service Order Medal from the antique store after the proprietor refuses to sell it to him without any authentication. Impressed by Lowe, Jim invites him to his house and introduces his daughter, Emily. Emily seems to be involved in some form of witchcraft and black magic or possesses supernatural powers. Lowe and Emily start an extramarital affair, and Emily offers to kill Mabel by using a voodoo sculpture of hers. Lowe agrees, and after Mabel's death, the two decide to get married. At the wedding reception, which only had Lowe, his son, Jim, and Emily, Emily cut open the head of the sculpture of the groom that was used as a decoration on the wedding cake. As soon as this happens, Lowe begins to bleed profusely from his head and drops dead on the table. Jim and Emily then explain to Lowe's son that they always answer the prayers of the child in one way or the other. The Elemental. This story begins with Reggie Warren, a businessman who conducts an act of dishonesty in the antique shop by trading the price tag to buy a snuff box at a cheaper price. He then boards the train to home, where he encounters a supposed psychic woman, Madame Orloff, who warns Warren that he has an element, which happens to be a spirit that sucks life out of the humans attached to himself. Warren doesn't pay much attention, considering the woman to be crazy, and reaches home. At home, Warren's wife Susan remarks that there's some repulsive smell that he's brought into the house. Susan is then attacked by the elemental in her sleep, and Warren decides to call Madame Orloff for help. Madame Orloff decides to perform some sort of evil warding off ritual, which leads to the house shaking and the TV exploding. Madame leaves satisfied that the supernatural entity has been expelled. However, this is far from the truth, given the elemental has only changed hosts and now possesses Susan. The elemental then kills Warren and wanders forth into the world in search of a new host. The Door. The movie begins with William Seaton, an amateur writer, bargaining the price of an ancient antique door with the proprietor. Seaton brings the door home and decides to use it as a door to the stationery cupboard. His wife, Rosemary, tells him that when she touches the door, she envisions a dusty and sinister old room. Seaton later discovers that at times the door becomes a portal to the mysterious otherworld, where he spots the Blue Room and decides to explore it. He then reads a 17th century manuscript written by an occultist, Sir Michael Sinclair. Sinclair apparently lures people through the door so that he may take their souls and become immortal. One day, Sinclair himself appears and abducts Rosemary to claim him as his last victim. In order to save his wife, Seaton begins hitting the door with an axe, which somehow also begins injuring Sinclair. After a fight with the wounded magician, Seaton rescues Rosemary and the two destroy the door. Sinclair and the Blue Room both crumble, indicating towards his end. Back in the shop, the proprietor is seen counting the money and finds that none is missing, which implies that Seaton wasn't dishonest and he didn't steal money. Maybe that's the reason he was alive at the end. All four segments are fairly interesting in their own way, with the second segment. There are no per se jump scares or conventional horror elements, but the stories evolve in a manner that holds on to the audience's excitement. This movie explores the genre of supernatural and mysterious entities that are often attached to old antique artifacts and how they differently impact the lives of the honest and dishonest new owners. Vampires. The story begins with two female vampires named Fran and Miriam, who were earlier lovers in their human form, luring unsuspecting people to their dilapidated house where they could feed on their blood. The story then progresses to a young couple, John and Harriet, who are out camping in their caravan near the very estate where the women bring their victims. One evening, a middle-aged man named Ted is brought in by Fran in their house to cater to her lustful needs and also her thirst for human blood. Ted wakes up with a wound on his arm, which he assumes is due to a broken wine glass. Fran returns at dusk, accompanied by Miriam and a young man, Rupert. That night, after Ted has fallen asleep, Miriam and Fran brutally murder Rupert and then feed on his blood, and Miriam advises Fran to murder Ted. The next morning, Ted departs in his car and on his way comes across an accident on the road. When he implores, he's left startled as he notices the victim is none other than Rupert. Ted then hurriedly returns to the house and locks himself in the wine cellar. The next day, the two women return with yet another suitor called the Playboy, whom they stab to death in the wine cellar. Ted garners all his remaining strength and escapes to the caravan. John decides to drive far away where they could all be safe, but before he can, he's murdered by Fran and Miriam and left in the car. The movie approaches its end with Ted finally escaping in his car and the realtor in the background selling the house to an elderly American couple, commenting that the real estate agency had a lot of trouble selling this property because of the rumors that it's haunted by two women who were murdered here. The movie is one of the earliest examples of a vampire horror genre that explored the context of homosexuality. The movie has some very grueling scenes of bloodshed, especially with the victims bleeding profusely and left in their car, and cannibalism. lust for the vampire. The movie begins in the year 1832 when a young man and an aspiring writer, Richard Lestrange, visits a reputed girl finishing school and falls in love instantly with a new student named Mircalla Herritzson. Later that evening, one of the serving girls at a village inn is found dead with 2 holes in her neck. This reaffirms Richard's belief about the urban legend of Count and Countess Karnstein, the 2 vampire couples whose terror had reigned the city for a long time. Richard then dupes one of the newly appointed English teachers at the girls' school and convinces him to go to Vienna instead and takes up his position. Soon, another girl, this time Mircalla's roommate, Susan Pally, had gone missing, and later that day, even the headmaster Giles Barton is discovered lifeless. When Richard ruffles through Baron's books, he's startled when he discovers that Mircalla in reality is Carmilla Karnstein, the resurrected daughter of the Count and Countess Karnstein. Richard confronts Mircalla about her being the vampire, which she denies, and to prove herself, makes love to Richard. When the police authorities arrive to investigate the strange disappearances and killings at the school, they're killed by the Karnsteins. Upon further investigation, it's revealed that Susan was a victim of a vampire attack. Infuriated, the villagers, along with a local priest, stormed the Karnstein castle with the intent of burning it. Richard somehow manages to make his way into the castle and save Mircalla, but fails as the villagers trap the 3 vampires in the burning castle. The scene proceeds with a timber from the ceiling falling and impaling Mircalla. The movie ends with Richard escaping the fire and the Count and Countess Karnstein remaining, indicating that fire cannot destroy the undead. The movie, along with vampire horrors, is also an occult classic, exploring the realms of satanic rituals of resurrection of the dead and converting them into vampires. The movie, obviously from its name, has multiple sexual content and nudity, along with gore, violence, and cold bloodshed, indicative of its vampiric genre. The movie also, at some point, aims at exploring the romantic angle between the human and the undead, which, over the years, has been widely presented in many vampire movies. Prey. The story revolves around a shape-shifting, savage alien creature referred to as Kator, who assumed the form of a human named Anderson, whom he'd earlier killed, and now takes shelter in the house of a lesbian couple, Joe and Jessica. The 2 women are vegetarian and live in seclusion with only some chicken and a pet parrot, Wally, for company. The arrival of Anderson causes a rift between the couple, given that Joe disapproves of the strange and socially awkward man living with them. Kator visits the spot where he'd killed the couple in the car. There, he comes across 2 policemen investigating the couple's abandoned car and devours them mercilessly. During dinner, Kator throws up because of eating a vegetarian salad, and Jessica fetches him some clean clothes. She comes across the bloodstained shirt of her boyfriend and a bloodied knife, which infers that Joe had murdered Simone. The next morning, Joe finds all the chickens slaughtered and assumes this to be the work of a fox. Anderson then hunts down a fox and presents it to the couple as a trophy. The trio decides to celebrate with a champagne party, and Joe dresses Anderson in drag and plays hide-and-seek. In between the game, Joe and Jennifer get into a heated discussion over Anderson's real motives, and frustrated Jessica reveals that she knows about Joe's involvement in Simone's murder. The next morning, Jessica and Joe get into an argument where Jessica says that she's sick of Joe's possessive control freak behavior and is leaving with Anderson now. Outraged by this, Joe assaults Jessica and leaves her unconscious. Assuming her to be dead, she runs into the woods and begins digging a grave to dump her body. Upon gaining consciousness, Jessica seduces Anderson in her bedroom. As they start to have sex, Kator's cannibal instinct is triggered and tears open Jessica's throat and starts feeding on her flesh. When Joe notices this, she's horrified, attempts to flee the house in the hope of escaping the monster predator. However, she falls into the open grave, screaming and wailing for her life as Kator approaches and the screen fades to black. Toward the end, Kator's seen communicating with his otherworldly companions, advising them to descend on Earth as humans are rich in protein. This movie is a classic alien invasion apocalypse and their cannibal traits. The movie is also a psychological thriller, given Joe's character is presented as a murderer who has anger issues and extreme possessiveness over her female partner. It's later revealed that Joe was herself an escapee from the psychotic facility, which could explain her fanaticism over Jessica. The scenes where Kator kills his prey are gut-wrenching. The movie does a good job of not directly revealing what happened to Joe and just leaves it to the audience's imagination. And soon, the darkness. The story revolves around 2 young nurses named Kathy and Jane who decide to take a cycling ride vacation across rural France and seem to encounter a strange man on a scooter on multiple occasions, such as a cafe and a cemetery. After riding for a while, the two women part ways. Kathy is then attacked by an unseen assailant. When Jane returns, she finds no signs of Kathy and finds her camera discarded in the grass. Moments later, the same strange man whom the women saw at the cemetery reappears and introduces himself as Paul. He offers to give Jane a ride back to the village on his scooter. Upon returning to the village, Jane learns about the unfortunate incident of the unsolved rape and murder of a young woman that occurred 3 years ago. And strangely, Kathy had vanished from the same acres where the incident happened. Concerned, Jane decides to visit the gendarme and report Kathy's disappearance, but can't locate him. Jane discovers that Paul had taken the film from Kathy and assumes that he had indeed hurt her. Jane finally locates the residence of the gendarme and explains what's occurred. The gendarme decided to investigate the case, asking Jane to wait at his residence. Soon after the gendarme had left, Paul breaks into the gendarme's house and Jane flees into the woods. She takes refuge in a camper at an abandoned trailer park but is horrified when she finds Kathy's corpse there. In the end, it's revealed that the gendarme had been the sexual predator all along who had murdered Kathy and was now trying to harm Jane, but Paul arrives and saves her in the nick of time. The movie has an impressive climax twist. More than the horror, it's the thriller and suspense genre that defines the movie. The movie keeps its audience engaged as it gets unpredictable with every sequence. The moment that the audience believes that they know who the villain is, they're served another plot twist. If any, the horror element of the movie is the struggle for survival for Jane, who tries her best to dissuade a potential killer, but in the end falls into the trap of the perpetrator. Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. The story revolves around a young doctor and an admirer of Frankenstein, Simon Helder, who gets convicted on the charges of sorcery and is assigned to a mental asylum where the head doctor is none other than Dr. Frankenstein himself. Impressed by Simon's interest in him, Dr. Frankenstein makes him his apprentice. Together, the duo work toward designing a new creature. Simon, however, remains oblivious to the fact that Frankenstein has been acquiring the body parts by murdering his patients. Frankenstein conducts this new experiment on a suicidal inmate named Herr Schneider. He remodels her into a creepy, bulk-up, ape-like creature. Soon, a new pair of eyes and a brain are tested to the supposed creature and turned him into a monster. Upon completion, the monster goes berserk and violent and embarks on a killing spree in the asylum to seek revenge. He brutally kills Klaus, the corrupt and perverted director of the asylum, and continues to hunt down other inmates. Ultimately, he's overpowered by the mob of inmates and destroyed. Frankenstein, however, seems unbothered by all the rampage and bloodshed that had followed and continues to organize his laboratory while planning upon who should be his next donor for his sinister experiment. The horror genre that captures the idea of the resurrection of the dead by using science and surgery has always been fascinating for the audience. The movie adequately highlights the goriness of the evil experimentation on the human body by a fanatic scientist and how he even justifies murdering innocent people to gain voluntary donors.
If you don't leave me alone, I'll shout!
The Shout. He says that once upon a time, a young man named Anthony was probed by a mysterious man after a sermon at the church about the idea of what are souls. If humans possess them, and if they do, where do they keep them? The strange man then follows Anthony to his home and invites himself to lunch. While having lunch, Crossley tells Anthony and his wife Rachel that he'd been living with Aboriginals of Australia for 18 years where, under the guidance of a sorcerer, he learned black magic. Crossley infuriates Anthony by claiming that the music he produces is empty and has no impact. He further claims that his shout has the power to kill any living being. Anthony then reverses, saying that he doesn't believe in the death shout magic of Crossley. Crossley asks Anthony to follow him to the dunes in the morning so that he can prove himself. After hearing the loud shout by Crossley, a shepherd and his sheep die instantly, but Anthony is saved because he'd been wearing earplugs. That evening, Crossley tells Rachel about the ability of the Aboriginal men to claim a woman they like as their wives by just possessing something that belongs to them and casting a spell on it. The next day, Crossley had enticed Rachel into his magical spell. Anthony finds a rock in which Crossley has trapped his soul and breaks it. This results in Crossley losing his strength. Back in the present, at a cricket match, it suddenly begins to rain, and all the inmates go berserk, including Crossley. Toward the end, Crossley shouts and ends up killing a doctor who was seated on the scoreboard ferry. The ferry then suddenly catches fire, leaving Crossley dead as well. The movie is engaging, given it remains uncertain even till the end what exactly are the motives of Crossley. It also dwells on the traditional themes of abstract magicians and sorcerers and the ability to possess a human soul. The horror emerges from Crossley's character, who appears sinister from the beginning and seems to be turning creepy with every progressive scene, leaving the audience with unpredictability and anticipation. The Blood on Satan's Claw. The movie is set up in an 18th century rural village where a farmer, Ralph, digs up a skull with one eye intact and a strange fur while ploughing. When he brings it to the notice of the judge, claiming it to be some sort of evil witchcraft practice, the judge disregards these claims and warns Ralph not to revive the tragic and forgotten superstitious practices of the past. Soon, inexplicable and unholy events began unfolding, with a woman named Rosalind's hand being replaced by a monstrous fur claw, the children in the village discovering a deformed body, and one of the children among them, Mark, is murdered by Angel Blake, who assumed herself to be a ringleader of a cult on account of him having the devil. Later, Kathy, Mark's sister, too suffers the same fate, but much more brutal, as she's ritualistically raped by a boy in the cult, and Angel Blake murders her and flays the fur from her back. Later, a young woman named Margaret, who's suspected of being involved in witchcraft, is questioned by the judge. She then tells the judge about the ritual that Angel Blake and other cult members will perform at the ruined church to resurrect the body of the demon and bring him to life. The judge then assembles a mob to destroy the cult. In the ensuing violence, Angel is killed and the judge kills the fur-clawed demon with a sword. The movie falls into the folk horror genre that explores the dark themes of witchcraft, cults, and antichrist rituals related to luring the devil. The scene related to the murder of innocent children in a sinister manner is truly disturbing and adds to the horrors of the audience. It also represents the eternal battle between superstitions and logic, and how the combination of both is what ensures the destruction of the demon. Full Circle. This is based on the novel Julia by Peter Straub. Julia, the protagonist, is distraught by her daughter Kate's death and decides to separate from her husband and live alone at a fully furnished house in Holland Park. Strange and inexplicable events start taking place, and she discovers the spirit of a young girl roaming throughout the house. When a seance is conducted, Julia is warned by the psychic Mrs. Flood that she must desert the house immediately as she's encountered something terrifying. She also tells Julia about a vision where she saw a boy bleeding to his death in a park. Curious, Julia inquires about the previous occupants of the house and gets to know about a woman called Heather Rudge who sold this property after her daughter Olivia had died. Upon further investigation, Julia discovers a boy called Jeffrey Braden who was found murdered in the park in the 1940s. Julia visits Jeffrey's mother and learns that her son was rather killed by children in the park on the pretext of a hate crime. Julia then visits David Swift, one of the alleged children involved in the murder, who's now an adult. David tells Julia how Olivia had brutally murdered Jeffrey and then also castrated him. Julia also visits Heather, who's now in a psychiatric home. Heather confesses that Olivia is intrinsically evil, and that's why she killed her after she learned of her involvement in Jeffrey's murder. Julia returns back home and finds Olivia playing with Kate's toy. Julia advances to hug Olivia, only to have her throat slashed by the sharp edge of the toy. This movie has all the conventional horror elements, starting with a haunted house, the spirit of an evil child, a seance that leaves people petrified upon the revelation, people dying one by one like a domino puzzle in a gruesome manner, the apparition of the ghost and its apathy towards any form of love or reformation. The movie would be well enjoyed by an audience who are fascinated by occult supernatural horror themes, especially centered around children. Countess Dracula. Recently widowed Countess Elizabeth Nadsarsdy of Hungary lures young beautiful women with the help of her lover, Dobie, and her maid Julie to kill them and bathe in their blood in order to temporarily restore her youthful appearance. To evade any suspicion for her crimes, she takes the identity of her 17-year-old daughter Ilona, who had been in reality held captive by Dobie in the woods. She also starts off an affair with a young lieutenant, Imre Toth, to further stay off the radar. Once, after murdering a prostitute, the Countess doesn't achieve the desired results, and she's told by the castle historian that her youth would only be restored if she used the blood of young, virgin women. Toward the end of the movie, the castle historian Fabio tries to reveal the truth about the Countess to Toth, but is killed by Dobie. Out of jealousy, Dobie tells the truth himself to Toth, but Elizabeth forces Toth to marry her. Dobie brings Ilona home to offer her as a sacrifice for restoring the Countess's youth, but she's saved by the maid, Julie. At the wedding, Elizabeth turns back old in her original form and tries to kill her daughter amidst the wedding ceremony, but accidentally kills Toth. In the climax, Julie, Elizabeth, and Dobie are arrested and sentenced to death, and are seen waiting in the hanging cellar with the villagers shouting. The story here, unlike other Dracula-related movies, is comparatively simpler. It mostly revolves around a cold-blooded countess who's so overpowered by her fanaticism for youthfulness and beauty that she's even willing to kill her own daughter to achieve that. The story also has a morally correct or happy ending, given the perpetrators are ultimately punished for their wrongdoings. Frightmare. The story is about a strange old couple who reside in an isolated farmhouse. The wife, Dorothy, had been released from a mental institution where she'd been admitted post-1957 after being found guilty of cannibalism. Her husband, Edmund, suffers from dementia. Dorothy begins luring young people at her home to offer them tarot readings and later brutally murdering them, followed by her cannibal feast. Soon, Debbie, Dorothy's daughter, who had been living with Jackie, her stepsister, gets involved in the murder of a barman and hides the body in the boot of a car. When Jackie discovers Debbie's bloodstained jacket, she approaches her boyfriend, who's also an investigative psychiatrist, to inform the police. Upon discovery of the body, it's revealed that it had the same injury, such as an eye missing, that is witnessed in Dorothy's victims. This reveals the fact that both Debbie and Dorothy have been indulging in cannibalism without Jackie's knowledge. Toward the end of the movie, Graham and Jackie try to probe Dorothy, but Graham is killed and Jackie is cornered by her stepmother and stepsister while growling for help as her father Edmund just looks and controls his urges to come to his daughter's aid due to his immense love for his mentally derailed wife. The movie has an unpredictable plot twist toward the climax, as most of us hope that Jackie will be saved at the 11th hour by her father, but that's far from what happens. The murderous cannibal scenes are surely gut-wrenching. It also investigates the psychological trauma that causes the emergence of such sinister and sadistic behavior of cannibalism among common people. Fright. The movie explores the story of a couple named Jim and Helen who hire Amanda, a young college student, to babysit their son, Tara. The couple lives in a large estate in the woods that makes the house seem haunted. While babysitting, Chris, Amanda's boyfriend, visits her and tells her how Jim and Helen are not married and that Helen's estranged husband had been admitted into a mental asylum following his failed attempt to murder Helen. Soon, Chris leaves the house but is brutally attacked by an unknown assailant. Unaware of this, Amanda is panic-stricken and calls Helen when she notices a silhouetted face staring back at her from the window. Helen suspects it to be her ex-husband Brian and thus inquires about him from the mental asylum, where she learns that he'd escaped the institution earlier in the night. At the front door, Amanda discovers a severely injured Chris who's been brought in by Brian, claiming to be a neighbor. Amanda soon grows suspicious of Brian and realizes that he's Helen's ex-husband. Toward the end, Amanda attempts to escape along with Tara, but is caught by Brian, who also kills Chris when he attempts to fight him. The police arrive along with Jim, Helen, and Dr. Cordell from the mental institution, and they all attempt to lure Brian out of the house. Brian takes Amanda and Tara hostage, threatening to kill them, and demands Helen to come inside. When Helen does, he attempts to kill her. After successful persuasion, Brian agrees to surrender to the police, but is shot dead by Amanda to avenge Chris's death. The movie presents an experience rightly ripped out of a nightmare, where a psychotic ex-husband with a murderous spree is out in the open, willing to prey on the innocent the moment he gets the chance. Amanda's attempt to escape the homicidal psychotic while trying to save the young boy and her growls for help is surely frightening and adequately horrifying. Psychomania, aka the Death Wheelers. A group of young adults who are part of a biking gang has always been a nuisance to society in general, but this nuisance turns to terror when the bikers have risen from the grave and are now the undead. Tom Latham, a potential psychopath and leader of a biker gang, takes an interest in black magic and consequently commits suicide after seeing the Frog God. His mother resurrects him from the dead, which turns him into an immortal with various supernatural powers at his disposal. He then persuades his entire gang to do the same and rise up from the dead, except his girlfriend, Abby. Tom claims that once you're dead, nothing else can harm you. Gaining immunity against any form of harm or death, the group renames themselves as the Living Dead and embarks on their journey of crime. The group brutally massacres people at a local pub, and then also the policemen who are out arresting the group members. Tom later persuades his girlfriend Abby to commit suicide and rise up as the undead, but she refuses. When Tom tries to kill her, his mother performs a ritual that breaks the powers of Tom and his other dead friends. As a result, Tom's mother is transformed into a frog, while the undead bikers, including Tom, are turned into stone. This movie would be of special interest to motorcyclists and bikers, as the biking scenes in the movie are pretty captivating. It also explores the folklore revolving around resurrecting the dead via black magic, the practice of conducting seances, and the petrification of people into stone. More than the horror sequences, the movie has some crazy stunt work, along with a heavy, spooky rock band music track, which makes it an enjoyable watch. Cry of Banshee. The story begins in the Elizabethan England era, where a corrupt and evil magistrate, Lord Edward Whitman, pronounces a young woman as a witch and orders her to be publicly tortured, whipped, and stoned by the people while she is mercilessly dragged through the city and then be positioned in the village stocks. One night, Whitman, assisted by his eldest son Sean, advances into the hills to hunt down witches and their cult. He kills several of them and warns the surviving ones to retire in the depths of the hills and never return. Infuriated by this, the leader of the coven, Una, pledges to take revenge on Whitman and his family. Una summons a demonic spirit that takes possession of a young royal servant, Roderick, who's now on the verge of killing everyone in the Whitman family. Roderick begins by killing Sean, Lady Patricia, and other members of the Whitman family. After being informed about these murders, Harry, Whitman's other son, pairs up with the priest, Father Tom, and together locate Una and her coven as they're conjuring the death of Maureen, Whitman's daughter, who had also been Roderick's lover. Una and the coven are killed by the duo, and Roderick loses his powers. However, he soon returns and attacks Whitman, but before he can kill him, Maureen shoots the demon in the head, thus killing Roderick. To ensure the safety of the remaining members of his family, Whitman decides to depart to a new town. In the end, we see that Roderick has returned once again, and after having killed Maureen and Harry, takes Whitman's carriage into an unknown trail. The movie explores the subject of witchcraft in 16th century England in a fairly interesting manner. The scenes of torture and whiplashing of the suspected woman and their cries for her while people sadistically enjoy her pain are truly traumatizing to watch. It presents the horror of black magic and occult practices, and how it could continue to reign its terror even when the primary magician or leader had been destroyed.
Nothing like that in my house this time.
Burke and Hare. Brothers Burke and Hare are two notorious young men who work as gravediggers in 19th century Edinburgh to supply corpses to surgeon Dr. Robert Knox for his anatomical lectures at the Medical Academy. Not much action is taken by the authorities, as they believe it's for the greater good of humanity. The duo of resurrectionists are paid €7, which is a fairly large sum of money at that time. When the graveyard supply fails to fulfill the growing demand of medical practitioners, the industrious pair make a devious plan of murdering old people who cohabit in their lodge and are anyways on the verge of dying and providing their corpses to Dr. Knox. Soon greed blinds their rationale, and they also start hunting younger victims, with their wives also assisting in their crimes. However, once they murder a well-known young man in the town called Draft Jamie, and when his body reaches Dr. Knox, the signs of struggle before death become apparent. This leads to Dr. Knox to suspect the sources behind these corpses. How Burke and Hare's illegal activities are busted by the common people and the police is the premise of the remaining movie. The movie falls into the horror comedy genre, even though instead of goofy, spooky spirits, it has a group of people on a murder rampage. The scenes of murder and struggle of the victims are presented in a comedic fashion, and the frequent music and festivities in the movie further deviate the audience from getting serious about the movie's subject. The creeping flesh. The plot of the movie is about a Victorian-era scientist, Professor Emmanuel Hilder. Hilder expresses to a young doctor in his laboratory that he'd uncovered a newer form of evil being that's mistakenly unleashed thousands of years sooner. He then recounts how the discovery was made, and the story moves into a flashback to the year 1894, where, in an expedition from New Guinea, he unearths an abnormally large humanoid skeleton that he assumes belonged to the Neanderthals, the early competitor species of the Homo sapiens. Hilden is positive that he'd be awarded the prestigious Richter Prize for his spectacular discovery. Emmanuel discovers that the skeleton had grown flesh when it had been exposed to water. He also believes that there's an evil in the giant skeleton that can spread like a contagious disease, but can also be eradicated. Emmanuel then creates a serum using the skin around the flesh on the skeleton's fingers to subdue the evil. When he tests the serum on a monkey, he finds encouraging results. Meanwhile, Hilden is also worried about his daughter Penelope's reaction after hearing the news of her mother's death. Hilden suspects that his daughter also shares the psychotic traits as her mother, which could lead her toward insanity. As a precautionary measure, Emmanuel injects his daughter also with the serum to contain her emotional and psychological outbursts. However, the next day, Emmanuel notices that the monkey who had been earlier injected with the serum had gone berserk and had gained invincible strength. Given the unintended consequence of the serum, Penelope also goes on a murder rampage in the city and assaults many others. Fearing that this revelation might hinder James's chances of winning the Richter Prize, he steals Emmanuel's research, including the skeleton. However, things get ugly when the skeleton is exposed to rain and it comes to life and escapes from the carriage in which it was being transported. At home, Emmanuel discovers that the fleshy finger that had been cut off from the skeleton has begun to move. Terrified at this spectre, he throws it in the fire to incinerate it, but now the creature, encased in flesh but otherwise hollow, eventually removes Emmanuel's finger but spares his life. Now back to reality, where Emmanuel's lab is a cell in the asylum, and he's an apparent inmate along with his daughter, Penelope. The movie ends with Emmanuel pleading for his release from the cells and calling someone to help. I'd be lying if I didn't admit that Peter Cushing was indeed excellent in this movie. He was spectacular in his performance as the gifted but unfortunate Professor Emmanuel Hilden. The movie surely creeps through your soul whenever the large skeleton and the flesh emanating out of it are shown. The movie makes an interesting case of psychological thriller, scientific fiction, along with actions and some very spooky moments. Crucible of horror. Walter Eastwood is a misogynistic, abusive, and patronizing patriarch of a dysfunctional nuclear family. He regularly physically and mentally assaults his wife, Edith, and ridicules his 18-year-old daughter, Jane. His son Rupert also reciprocates his problematic traits of demeaning the female members of the family. Edith is an artist and is always mocked for her work, and her daughter isn't allowed to get a job even when her father denies her any monetary allowance. Over one family dinner, Jane is inappropriately touched by Walter's friend, Gregson. Walter, however, dismisses these claims and instead brutally punishes Jane with a cane after accusing her of stealing money. Victimized by their misery, the ladies chart out a plan to murder Walter. The mother-daughter duo drug Walter and also drown his body in a pond, but are then haunted by frightening nightmares. At the climax, Walter joins his family at the breakfast table, and Edith only manages to tear silently. Multiple conspiracy theories revolve, with one being that Walter returned back as a zombie or ghost who would continue to haunt his wife and daughter. Another is that Edith and Jane lost their sanity and now were imagining Walter's presence, who's now dead. The last one is that Walter knew of their plan beforehand, and thus he made arrangements to escape successfully, and thus he never died. Demons of the Mind. A widower named Baron Zorn keeps his children, daughter Elizabeth and son Emil, imprisoned in his own house as he believes that his children had inherited the insane traits of their dead mother. He also keeps the two siblings apart as there's been an incestuous attraction between them. Elizabeth tries to escape once again but is captured by her aunt and brought back to the estate. To get his children rid of their mental instability, Zorn calls a Dr. Falkenberg to heal them. Elizabeth also has a lover, Carl, who tries his best to help her escape from her house and father. Meanwhile, in the village, young women are being raped and murdered, and the perpetrator is on the loose, with many believing it to be a demon instead of a human. Toward the end, the villagers charge to Baron's estate, believing it's him who's been terrorizing the woods and killing women. When both his kids finally escape, Baron pursues them and kills Emil, but is unable to shoot at Elizabeth. The villagers and the priest arrive and overpower Baron, hold him down, chop off his hand, and drive a burning cross across his chest. The movie is extremely complex, with multiple stories interplaying in the background. The psychotic behavior of the two siblings and their quest for freedom from the chained walls of their house form most of the premise. The movie depicts how, back in the days before Enlightenment, mental illness was only treated with fictitious rituals and superstitions that were often detrimental to the lives of the people. Horror of Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist and an anatomy fanatic, coldly murders his father when the latter forbids him from continuing his experiments. Victor then assumes the title of Baron von Frankenstein and uses the inherited family fortune to secure admission in a medical school in Vienna. But given his incorrigible attitude of being a womanizer, he impregnates the dean's daughter and is forced to return back home. Once settled back in his own castle, he sets up a laboratory and indulges in a series of sinister experiments that involve resurrecting the dead. Eventually, he models an entirely new creature by combining the human body parts and then bringing it to life. Once the creature is formed, it turns homicidal and goes on a murderous rampage until being accidentally destroyed when a vat where it's been hidden is flooded with acid. The movie has the usual trope of the Hammer production in the Frankenstein franchise, where a scientist with ominous motives fuels life into the dead and then that monster goes berserk, creating havoc left, right, and center. It's an enjoyable watch, with instances of occasional horror and humor to keep the story engaging. Marvelous verdict. The marvelous verdict at the end of the video would be that all these horror movies surely ignite a roller coaster of emotions, where at some point you're horrified by the sudden appearance of the frightening ghost or the monster, and at others you're thrilled in anticipation of what would transpire in the climax. You'd also be left visibly disturbed whenever the movies make reference to the formidable practices of witchcraft and occult rituals, and also be flustered when suddenly some characters strip naked, even if the story didn't necessarily require them to. The decade of the 1970s has been a pure gem when it comes to horror movies in the English industry, and we just elucidated some that you could watch when you're in for a scare. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.